Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video where I go over my stats from 2025, my reading wrap up that Storygraph gives to you, and going over the reading goals that I set for myself in 2025, seeing how well I did them, and then talking about my reading goals for 2026. Full disclosure, I did already film this video and I just didn't like how it turned out. I thought that content-wise, I liked everything I said and I liked the way I did it, but the video just looked bad. I was really busy for a couple weeks and I just really wanted to film it but couldn't find the time to sit down in front of the good lighting during the day to do it, and so I did it at like 7 p.m. when it was already dark out in front of my computer. The lighting was awful, my hair looked terrible, it was not a good angle, like it was just a mess. So I'm redoing this and hopefully the second time is as good as the first. So let's get right into my 2025 reading wrap up. Like I said, I use Storygraph for this. I've used Storygraph to track my books for several years now. I'm very pleased with their service. I feel like they're one of the few apps that genuinely get better with every update, as opposed to just like slightly changing how the app looks. So I love Storygraph. I've been thinking about buying the pro version for probably a year at this point, and maybe for my birthday I will just go ahead and buy it for myself, but that's how much I like Storygraph. In 2025, I read 314 books across 114,726 pages. That is by far the most amount of books I've read in a year. I think last year it was like 140 or like 150, somewhere around there. So I doubled that last year, and I really don't know how I did that. I think primarily it's just because I started using the library so much. I really got involved with my library, and my library system is amazing. It's like a statewide library system, so we just have so much more access to books than I think a lot of other library systems do. So I was able to physically get my hands on so many books, and I prefer physical reading, so it just like really spurred me on. And then I also think what really helped was like doing challenges, doing r/fantasy bingo, and then doing the female gaze SFF summer and spring challenge, and the winter and fall challenge, but because it just pushed me outside of my comfort zone, and it pushed me to read from new authors or popular books or newer books that maybe I wouldn't have ever gotten to on my own because I'm pretentious like that. So it just really pushed me outside my comfort zone, pushed me to read stuff. My problem is that I'm such a mood reader, and I'll read anything, but like I have to know it exists, right? So my problem is that I just couldn't find stuff to read. I was just reading the same authors over and over again, or rereading a lot in the past, because I didn't know that there was all this stuff out there that I would be really interested in and really love. So I feel like I really discovered a lot of new authors that I love in 2025 and started reading all their stuff. And again, the library was such a massive help in that, and then also reading is my primary hobby. I don't really watch TV or movies. I play a little bit of video games, but I didn't play a lot of video games this year. Like last year, I think it was because Baldur's Gate 3, I played so much Baldur's Gate 3 that I wasn't reading as much, and that's why my numbers were lower. Reading's my primary hobby. I make time for it, and I just read very fast. This is something that's natural, that's something I think that you can practice over time and just get better and better at. I devote a lot of time to reading. I read very fast, so I can sit down and read like a 300-page book in like 3 or 4 hours and have it be done with, as opposed to like having to stop and start and taking like 5 days to read a book. So I just read more because it seems a lot more manageable to me. I'm like, I can totally knock that out and be done with it. That's how I read so much. Again, this is by far the most I've read in a year. I'm really curious to see if this pace is sustainable, if I will continue reading this much in 2026, or if it was just like a one-time thing, like just the novelty of the library and having access to so many books pushing me into it, and doing all the challenges pushing me into it. But we'll see. I read a lot, but I don't feel like I was reading just to get the numbers up. Like everything I read, when I scroll back and look at the covers, I remember it. I remember reading it, and I remember I didn't just pick a bunch of graphic novels or novellas. I mean, no shame to you if you read primarily those things and you do that specifically to reach your reading goal. Like truly, I don't really care about anyone else's reading habits or what they do or how they are reading. But for me, it's like, that's not what those numbers are coming from. So I'm just like, is this sustainable? I don't feel like I'm just picking up stuff to pick stuff up and to say I read a lot of books, but who knows? Like maybe I'm truly just like, I can't do that pace, I can't sustain that pace, and I go back down to 150, which is still so many, or just go back down to 70 books a year or something like that. So I'm very curious to see. what it will be like in 2026. The first book I read in 2025 was The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. That was a great first book, I think, to start the year off with. It was really interesting. I had never read from him before, but I found it to be very profound and a very good start to the year. And then the last book I read was The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. I told myself in 2024, you are going to finish the Lord of the Rings series in 2025. And then I didn't until literally December 31st. It took me forever to read The Fellowship, and so I didn't want to start Two Towers and Return of the King for a really long time. And then finally I was just like, you said you were going to read it this year on December 30th. I was like, you said you're going to read it this year, at least start these books so that you can say you started them. And then surprisingly, Two Towers and Return of the King just were so much quicker reads for me, and I really enjoyed them. And I really enjoyed Return of the King, and I felt like it was a great way to end the year. I read the most pages in December. I read over 10,000 pages in December, and I read the most books, I think, in May. I read 32 books in May, but closely followed behind with December, where I read 31 books in December. I read the least amount of books in April and February, which is interesting. And it looks like trend-wise, I did read more towards the end of the year, except in September when I only read 23 books. Interesting. I did meet my reading goal. I always set my reading goal pretty low and manageable, because for me it's not about reading as many books as I can possibly get my hands on. It's about just making sure I'm reading and I'm keeping that up. So I set my goal usually at like 75 books. I think last year I set it at 50, and I again hit that pretty easily, so I wanted to just be like, okay, 75. So I reached 400% of my reading goal this year. The genres I spent the most time with in 2025. Top, obviously, we have fantasy with 174 books. Second, we have LGBTQIA, also not really a surprise, with 110 books. Next, again, not a surprise, science fiction with 84 books. And then in fourth and fifth place is romance with 41 books read, and then literary with 39 books read. The only thing that's a surprise to me there is having romance not only in my top 5, but to be above literary, because I just feel like I do not pick up romance. I don't gravitate towards it, and I do try to read like more classics or more lit fic and stuff like that. It's just a genre I would say I prefer over romance. So that was interesting to me. And then when I went in and actually looked at those stats, what was making up those romance books, it was 90% fantasy books with a romance subplot that were also tagged as romance on Storygraph. And I'm sure that same thing happened with like fantasy and sci-fi books where they were tagged as both, and so that's why maybe the numbers don't entirely add up here, but that's where a lot of the romance was coming from. It was either straight up romantasy that I picked up for challenges and stuff, like The Night of the Moth, I think, is the only thing I can really think of that I picked up knowing it was romantasy and giving it a try anyways. And it, you know, it showed me, you know, there's a reason why I don't pick it up. Like, it's just not for me. And then a lot of it was also fantasy books with a very heavy romance subplot, like the Burning Kingdom series by Tasha Suri, other lesbian fantasy books, because I have a weakness for lesbian fantasy books, but that is where that was coming from, which made a lot more sense. The longest book I read was At the Feet of the Sun by Victoria Goddard, which is the sequel to The Hands of the Emperor. I really liked The Hands of the Emperor. It's a very like slice of lifey book, but I really enjoyed it. I felt it was very emotionally impactful. I really liked the main character in that. At the Feet of the Sun, I liked, but not as much. And I think maybe that was just because I read it right after I read At the Hands of the Emperor, and I was kind of rushing through it because I just wanted to see where the two leads would end up in regards to their relationship with each other, because it's such a fascinating relationship, and I just wanted to see development in that regard. And I wasn't entirely pleased with how that played out. It just felt like a lot of no development, and then all of it happens at the very end. But I also just think I wasn't in the headspace to appreciate a slice of life book in that moment, because I had just read another very long, very slice of life book, and I'm just not really a cozy slice of life person, so I needed to space it out, and I didn't. That's on me, but I did enjoy it. Then the shortest book I read was The Encounter by K.A. Applegate, which is an Animorphs book. It's only 91 pages. Me and my friends were reading a lot of Animorphs books over the course of the year. I read them as a child. My friend did not. We never finished the series because they knew about a character death that happens in the series, and they didn't want to get to that point because it was too sad. The least amount of time I spent on a book was one day with The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm sure there are a lot of like novellas or shorter books that I read in a day, but that's just the one it picked. And then of course, the most time I spent on a single book was The Book of the New Sun with 211 days. That's almost 7 or 8 months, I think, and that tracks. I'm pretty sure I got that book out from the library in late January, and I didn't return it until like August or September, so that tracks. But it's actually 4 books in one. It's a very long book. and I ended up really loving it. I talk about it in my favorite books of the year list. It's just a crazy wild ride, and I really enjoyed it. To me, it felt like the experience of reading Ulysses by James Joyce, where it's like, you do feel like you were rewarded for pushing through, and it didn't really feel like I was pushing through. Like, it's just one of those books where you kind of have to accept that you're not going to understand every single thing that happens, and I think some people are not going to like that, and they're going to give up, and some people are going to be like, okay, I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with that. So it was worth it in the end to me. According to Storygraph, the authors I spent the most time with were number 1, Martha Wells with 11 books. That, I was gonna say I was kind of confused by that, but it makes sense. I finished the Murderbot series this year in 2025, which is like 7 books, so that's a lot. And then I also reread, I love to reread her older fantasy. I feel like it's very rereadable. City of Bones and The Death of the Necromancer, 2 of my favorite books from her. And then I also reread Witch King in preparation for the sequel, Queen Demon, which came out in 2025, so that makes sense. I read a lot from her that year. And then, of course, Ursula K. Le Guin is second with 10 books read. Ursula K. Le Guin is my number 1 author forever. Love her work. I have so many right here. I read a lot of new books from her this year. There were a lot that I hadn't gotten to yet that I kind of finished out this year. I had a very, very intense fling with Ursula K. Le Guin in undergrad, probably around like 2022, 2023, and I read most of her backlist, and then I just read so much that at a certain point you're just like, okay, I'm gonna stop before I burn myself out on her. And so this year I went back to finishing out some of the books that I hadn't read from her. And of course, I always have to reread The Left-Handed Darkness and The Dispossessed, so enjoyed those as well. And then underneath that is T. Kingfisher with 8 books read. And it's funny because I did read 8 T. Kingfisher books, but I still don't really like T. Kingfisher. I think I've just really learned that she's not super for me. Her books are very comedic and very romantic, and those are just 2 things that I don't know if I really love in fantasy. I liked some of her books well enough. I think my favorite was probably Nettle and Bone, but everything else was just kind of mediocre to good. And I don't know if I'll be continuing to pick her stuff up in the future. Maybe it's just like palette cleanser reads in between stuff, because I feel like the biggest detriment was that I was reading them all like back to back. Like, I read the entire Saints of Steel series back to back to back, and I truly feel like her protagonists are very samey. Her protagonists all feel like the same woman. A lot of her love interests also feel very samey, and a lot of the plots of those books are very similar traveling fantasy type of plots. So it's like, I don't know if necessarily it was the best idea to read it that way. I think maybe reading books as they come out with gaps, months or even years in between, would probably be work better for me, because I do find myself enjoying her works. It's just not, again, it's not something that I gravitate towards or would really, again, I don't think I would shotgun them all back to back like I did again. So that was interesting to me that it was T. Kingfisher. And I didn't like that Storygraph only shows you the top 3 authors instead of like the top 5. So I went and looked up my top 5, and it turns out that tied for 5th place, basically tied for 4th and 5th, are Melissa Scott and Lois McMaster Bujold with 7 books each, which makes a lot more sense to me than T. Kingfisher. I remember reading Melissa Scott and Lois McMaster Bujold's books so much better and enjoying them so much more. I really, really loved reading Melissa Scott this year. I love her works. I love her science fiction and her fantasy. And Lois McMaster Bujold obviously wrote the Vorkosigan Saga, which I did read a lot of this year. I'm not done with it. I still have a couple of the standalone books that were never put into omnibuses left. I was reading them in omnibus order, but I read a lot of it and I really enjoyed it. I would say it's probably not like a favorite series of mine. I have political problems with the series that just come down to me being, you know, me being that one friend that's too woke, but I still really enjoyed the series, and I really love Miles, and I do want to do a video talking about the Vorkosigan Saga at some point, because they are just it's such a long, complicated series that it always somehow sneaks out of my wrap-ups, because I'm just like, I can't sit here for 40 minutes talking about the Vorkosigan Saga right now. So I would love to do a standalone dedicated video about that book, maybe as part of I do also want to do a video on like sci-fi stories and space opera stories, so maybe as part of that or as a related video. But yeah, I loved reading that, and I also loved reading a lot of Melissa Scott. So to me, those are authors that I feel like were more personally impactful on me than T. Kingfisher, even though I technically read more T. Kingfisher. According to Storygraph, I was also part of one official completed buddy read. I believe that was Metal from Heaven by August Clark with my friend Elsa. Hi Elsa, if you're watching this. I don't know how you would be, but hi. Loved that book, it was very fun. And I was technically part of 3 or 4 buddy reads. I read all the books, okay? I read all the books. But only one person also marked it as finished on Storygraph. So there's that one. It says my average rating is 4.93. That is not correct because I don't star rate my books. I only star rate them if they got a full perfect 5-star rating from me. Otherwise I just write a detailed review. So my rating average is kind of fucked up because if there are books that I rated from before I stopped rating books, like a reread, if I'm rereading a book that I did give like a 4.25 and then I reread it, it fucks up your numbers, it fucks up your average. So that's where that's from. But my 2025 5-star reads were Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, The Heart of the Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, The Winged Histories by Sophia Samatar, He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan, The Saint of Bright Doors by Bhadra Chandrasekhara, Tahanu by Ursula K. Le Guin, Five Ways to Forgiveness by Ursula K. Le Guin, Always Coming Home by Ursula K. Le Guin, and Exordia by Seth Dickinson. Only 2 of those were rereads, Tahanu and Exordia. Loved both of those books. Everything else was a first-time read. And of those books, the only one that didn't make it onto my top 10 books of the year list was Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I don't know why. I think there were just other books that I liked a little bit more, and I couldn't fit it into my honorable mentions, but I still did really love that book. It's so short, but so impactful and so well done. And it also reminded me a lot of the movie Queer, which I had just watched, like literally the night before, reading Queer, so it was a fun experience. The book that I read that the most other users also shelved was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, with over 500,000 other shelves. Funny because this was one that I just thought was mid, you know. I didn't hate it enough to put it on my top 10 worst books of the year list. I didn't hate it at all, but I also didn't love it, and I had a lot of complaints about it, and the series as a whole ended up kind of disappointing me, so that's a mid one for me. And then the least shelved, with only 133 other users shelving it, is Horhath Stories, Transgressive Tales by Aliens by Eleanor Arnason. This is a short story collection based in her Horhath universe, which is a sci-fi story that I love. It's based off of standalone book in that series is Ring of Swords by Eleanor Arnason, which is one of my favorite books of all time. I think I did talk about it in the video on my channel that's like my favorite books of all time, which might need an update soon, but we'll see. I love that short story collection. It's so charming, and it's fun because there's a really unique framing narrative. It's a framing narrative that all of these short stories were written by the Horhath after they made contact with humans, and so all these taboo ideas about the humans like started circulating and causing them to like basically write like human Sherlock Holmes fan fiction, which I thought was very fun. The highest rated book that I read this year, with the highest average rating, was Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee with a 4.64, which is ironic considering I did not like Jade Legacy. I was very disappointed by it despite really liking the first 2 books in the series, and it was on my most disappointing books of the year list. I explored the works of 149 new authors, including John Steinbeck, Claire Keegan, and Cameron Hurley. I liked John Steinbeck and Claire Keegan. I did not like Cameron Hurley. 170 books I read were part of a series. The one they've chosen to be emblematic of that is Moonstorm by Yoon-Ha Lee, which is ironic considering that's one of the ones I'm definitely not going to continue because it just felt like 9 Fox Gambit Teen Edition, and I am just not a teenager, so I wasn't that into it. I reread a total of 30 books this year. Again, I do love a reread. I DNF'd 4 of the books I picked up this year. Let's go look at what those were. Letters to Half Moon Street by Sarah Wallace. I read like 50% of this, and then my Hoopla loan ran out, and I just wasn't interested enough to check it back out. It's not the book's fault, it's my fault. I don't like epistolary novels. I don't really like the Victorian era, so it just was never gonna happen. I also DNF'd A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos. I picked this up for a prompt for like the Floating Worlds prompt, and I just wasn't feeling the book. It's a YA fantasy. I don't read a lot of YA fantasy. I was reading it on my phone and that was just not the vibe. It's a pretty long book. It's like a 500-page book, and you know, on my phone it was like 1,000 pages. So I'm like, I'm just not feeling this on my phone right now. So I DNF'd it. I'm saying I might come back to it. I'm probably not gonna come back to it. I just don't really like YA fantasy. I also DNF'd The Worst Journey in the World by Apsley Cherry Garrard. I picked this up because I love the TV show The Terror, and I feel like a lot of people get into that show and then get into real polar expeditions, and so I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to try it out, and sadly, I just don't think that's where my interest in the show lies. I like the show for other reasons, not because of the expedition really like format. And this book was not a great intro to those topics because it kind of assumes you already know all these previous expeditions and people involved, and I did not. So I maybe would read more books on this topic, but just this was not a great starting point, so I DNF'd it. And then I also DNF'd Melusine by Sarah Monette, aka Catherine Addison. I love Catherine Addison. I love the Summer in Terrace of Amalur series, the Goblin Emperor series. This one, I got like 70 pages in and I just wasn't feeling it. I'm like, I'm just not in the mood to read fantasy A Little Life right now. Maybe in the future I'll come back to this one because again, I do love Catherine Addison so much. I'm like, maybe I should give it a try, but I was not in the mood at the moment for what it was. I read 48 books from my own shelves this year. I successfully completed 3 reading challenges. Literally at the final second, I finished r/fantasy bingo with Return of the King for the Elves Square. And then there's my 2025 at a glance. And then I also want to talk about how I was reading my books. I tracked this. I read 196 books from the library. So almost 2/3 of the books that I read were from the library, which again, that's how I'm able to read so much. I read 61 books that I physically owned, whether that was I read them from the library first and then liked them so much I purchased them was probably a couple of those, but a lot of it is just books that I previously owned. I read 43 books that were EPUBs or ARCs that I again own, and then I read 15 books from Overdrive, so from Libby or Hoopla. Yeah, and now I want to go back and look at my reading goals for 2025. I wrote these about halfway through the year because that's when I started keeping a reading journal in about July of 2025. So I was kind of already working on these goals at that time, and then I just codified them. So I wanted to read 100 books a year, which check. I wanted to read at least 5 classics, which check. I wanted to participate in bingos and challenges, which check. And then I wanted to read at least 10% nonfiction, which I did not do. I think I read like 4% nonfiction, which is not high. The problem is just that I do read so many books that to have it be 10% nonfiction, I would have to read a lot of nonfiction, which I did not prioritize doing because I just don't gravitate towards it. And I feel like my problem is that I'm actually interested in a lot of nonfiction topics, so much so that I can't pick one. You know, I can't just be like, okay, I'm interested in this, and so I'll just pick up a bunch of books on this topic. I'm interested in a lot of stuff, so I can't just pick a lane and decide what I would like to read about. So when we talk about my 2026 goals, I'll talk more about how I'm actually planning on committing to that in the future. And then overall, my quantitative goals were to use the library, which I did, to prioritize quality over quantity, which I do feel like I did, to find a new favorite author. I found Avadra Chandrasekhara and Melissa Scott, who I both really, really loved this year. I also had a couple of TBR books that I wanted to make sure I read in 2025, and I managed to read all of them. It was a mix of upcoming or new releases that I wanted to make sure I got to. Moth Eater by Linda Kodega, which I enjoyed. It's a very messy debut novel, but I liked it well enough I would read more from this author. Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chapeko, which I came to for the bisexual vampire throuple, and that's what I received, and so I was happy. Tomb of Dragons by Catherine Addison, which I enjoyed, but slightly disappointed me. I talked about it in my disappointments of the year video. Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. I enjoyed this. I didn't love 2 of the 3 framing narratives of this story, so I came away from it just enjoying it, not loving it. Death of the Author by Nnedi Okorafor. I feel like I hated the reading experience of this book, but there's a big twist at the end and kind of reframing of the story that I at least found very interesting, and I find myself with more positive thoughts about this book with time. Like, I don't remember all the stuff I hated about the book. I just remember being like, that was a cool twist, and I enjoy that she took a big swing. I will always appreciate authors taking big swings and being experimental, even if it didn't necessarily work out the best for me. Drop of Corruption by Robert Jackson Bennett, one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and I did not like it, sadly. I talk about it again in my Worst Books of the Year video. He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan, loved, one of my favorite books of the year. Isle in the Silver Sea by Tasha Suri, again, one of my most anticipated reads, and just turned out to be a big disappointment. We talk about it in that video as well. Queen Demon by Martha Wells, one of my most anticipated reads of the year, and I actually loved it. It was just as good as the first book. I really loved it. I'm so excited to see more in this universe, in this world, and I hope she writes like 10 books in this series. I just want more. To Clutch a Razor by Veronica Roth, the sequel to When Among Crows, which was a very big surprise of the year, like a book that I just discovered out of nowhere and did not think I was gonna like, and then was very pleasantly surprised by. And To Clutch a Razor was even better, I thought. I found the characters more interesting and the plot more interesting as well. So I enjoyed that one. Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, a book that I was tentatively excited about. I love lesbian vampires, but I also am very hit or miss with V.E. Schwab, so I was like tentatively interested to read this. I ended up really hating it. It's again on my Worst Books of the Year list. And The Incandescent by Emily Tesh. I mostly wanted to read this because I liked Emily Tesh's sci-fi story, Some Desperate Glory, and I was interested to see what she would do with fantasy. And it's also unique because it's a magic school book written from the perspective of a teacher, which is interesting. This book was just okay. It was just average. I enjoyed it, but I'm not really gonna think about it, and it wasn't one of my best reads of the year. One of my favorite things I did this year was read the nominees for the Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Fiction. It was a great experience. I loved a lot of the books on the list, and only one of them really I didn't like or regret reading. Even the ones I didn't love, I was like, okay, I at least appreciate what these books are doing, and I can see why they were nominated. I loved Rake's Fall, again, one of my favorite books of the year, one of my new favorite authors. Very excited to see what Vajra Chandrasekhara does next. I really also loved Andrea Hairston's Archangels of Funk. I went and read all of her published novels and really enjoyed them. Nhi Vo is a casually favorite author of mine. I thought that the novel that she had that was nominated, The City in Glass, was not her best work, and not really awards worthy, but like I still enjoyed it. I liked it. And then I also really enjoyed North Continent Ribbon by Ursula Witcher, just a very pleasant surprise of a book. Really enjoyed it. I hope she writes a full novel in that world in the future. And everything else, again, I at least thought that was interesting. I appreciate that the author tried that. I appreciate that they were experimental and trying to do different things. So I will definitely do that again in 2026. And then my reading goals for 2026. First of all, with my checklist goals, my quantitative goals, read 100 books, read 10% nonfiction. And the way I'm going to do it this year is every month I'm going to commit to reading at least 2 nonfiction books. One of them is going to be just a brand new nonfiction book at the library that is in a topic I'm interested in. And the other one is going to be randomly generated with a random number generator, and I'm going to go and pick the closest book on the shelf to that Dewey Decimal number. So the first book I read, maybe I'll talk about it in my January wrap-up. It was like about a woman trying to break into like the white collar business industry, and how difficult that is if you weren't brought up like in the middle class, learning how to write a resume and how to navigate that world, which is really interesting. And then I also want to read one book outside of my comfort zone per month, so maybe like a romance book or a historical book, something like that. And then I would also, again, in the next year, like to do the Female Gaze Bingo, the Spring Summer Challenge, and the Fall Winter Challenge, and then also do the 2026 r/fantasy bingo. And I would like to make at least one YouTube video per month, so let's get on that. My overall goals, again, are to use the library. I would also like to utilize the Kobo I got for Christmas. I have been reading a lot on that. I did get the free trial for Kobo Plus and enjoyed it well enough that I think I will shell out $8 a month to continue that, because it's just, I don't know, I feel like it's a good way to get lesser known authors. So I would like to do that as well. I would like to find new authors, hidden gems. I'm not committing to finding a new favorite author like I did last year, because I feel like that's just like asking a lot. And I was very lucky to find a new favorite author, 2 new favorite authors in the last year. But I would like to find hidden gems, lesser known authors. You know, I love me a good lesbian sci-fi fantasy book from the 80s and 90s. So I'm gonna continue to be on the prowl for those. I would also, again, in general, just like to read outside my comfort zone. I think this is where the challenges really help with that. I don't want to just turn down books because maybe I think I'm not going to like them. I would like to continue to push myself in that regard. And then also, I would like to keep an open mind and an open heart when it comes to reading. You know, I want to go into every book thinking, even if I don't like this, I'm going to learn something from it. So I would just love to keep an open mind in that regard. So those were my 2025 stats, and those were my 2025 goals and what I have planned for 2026. Thank you so much for watching this video. I would love to know your goals for 2026. If you had any goals for 2025 that you successfully accomplished or that you didn't, you know, let's commiserate together. That 4% nonfiction is gonna haunt me for the rest of my life, but I would love to hear from you guys, and thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.